The settlement document arrived at the offices of Hargreaves and Potts, solicitors of some standing in the city of York, folded in thirds and sealed with the crest of the Fenwick family, and it contained, buried in its second paragraph, a single phrase that would determine the fate of two women who had never been consulted about their own fates at all. I should warn you, my dear friends, before I go any further. This is the kind of story that requires you to pay attention to the legal details, because the legal details are precisely where the truth of it is hiding. Bear with me. It will not take long, and it is worth every word. The document was a proposed marriage agreement. On one side, Jasper Fenwick, Viscount of Coldmere, a man of 36, whose ancestral estate in the North Riding of Yorkshire had been producing excellent wool for 3 centuries, but whose liquid assets had been catastrophically depleted by his late father's habit of investing in schemes that never quite bore fruit. On the other, Sir Douglas Aldgate, Baronet of Aldgate Hall in the quiet village of Branston, whose own debts, accumulated over 20 years of keeping up appearances on a shrinking income, had reached a figure that caused his solicitor to lose sleep on his behalf. The arrangement was, in its essentials, this. Frances Aldgate, the elder daughter of Sir Douglas, had inherited from her maternal grandmother a marriage settlement of considerable size, held in trust by the Court of Chancery, and accessible only upon her marriage. The settlement was substantial enough to clear Lord Fenwick's encumbered northern properties, and, as part of the marriage portion arrangement, settle Sir Douglas's most pressing obligations as well. 2 problems. 1 legal document. A solution that benefited every party, at least on paper. The document named her explicitly Miss Frances Aldgate, elder daughter of Sir Douglas Aldgate, of Aldgate Hall in Branston. There was no ambiguity about the name. There was, however, an enormous ambiguity about whether Sir Douglas Aldgate had actually registered, in any meaningful way, that Frances was the daughter the document was talking about. He had not. He read it twice, in his study with his hands not quite steady, and both times his eye slid past his elder daughter's name, the way eyes slide past familiar wallpaper. Present, recognized, entirely unremarkable, because Frances had been unremarkable in her father's estimation for a very long time. He had 2 daughters. One was 22 and remarkable. One was 28 and was not, which is to say, she was the kind of woman the marriage market had long ago sorted into the category of settled and filed away. I want to stop here, my dear friends, and say something I have learned across a great many years of sitting by fires and collecting other people's stories. The category of settled and filed away is not a judgment of character. It is not even truly a judgment of beauty, though it is often dressed up as one. It is simply a failure of attention. It is what happens when the people who are supposed to know you best stop looking at you altogether, and rely instead on the category they assigned you years ago, without ever going back to check whether it still fits, or whether it was accurate to begin with. Arabella Aldgate was lovely. There is no point in pretending otherwise. She had her mother's golden colouring and her father's easy manner, and she had grown up in the warm light of everyone's admiration, with the particular confidence that consistent admiration, received early and often, will produce in a young person. She was not calculating in any vicious sense. She was simply a young woman who had understood from a very early age that the world responded warmly to her face, and had organized her expectations accordingly. Frances had understood something rather different from a very early age. She had understood that the estate accounts would not balance themselves, that the tenants' repairs would not be ordered unless she ordered them, and that the household at Aldgate Hall would run on whatever quiet, practical competence she could bring to it, because no one else was going to provide it. She had made her peace with this, or had convinced herself that she had, which amounts to the same thing, until someone comes along and shakes the whole careful structure of the peace you have built. She found the document on her father's desk 3 days before Lord Fenwick was expected to arrive. She had been looking for the household ledger which her father had borrowed and not returned. The document was not hidden. It was simply there in the middle of the desk, as though it were of no more consequence than a seed catalogue. She read it standing up, in the cold morning light, and she understood it immediately. She had been managing the family's financial correspondence for 7 years. Legal documents held no mystery for her. Her name was there in the second paragraph. The settlement was hers, tied to her marriage, and the entire arrangement depended on her consent and her signature. Her father had not yet mentioned it to her. She stood with the document in her hands for a long moment, and she felt something she could not quite name. Not anger exactly, and not grief exactly, but the particular weary recognition of a woman who has spent 7 years being indispensable and has just found, in a single page of legal text, a precise and rather devastating measure of exactly how thoroughly she has been relied upon, without ever once being seen. She put the document back where she found it. She said nothing to anyone. She went to find the household ledger, which was, as it turned out, behind the globe in the corner where her father always left things he had borrowed and stopped thinking about. Lord Jasper Fenwick, Viscount of Coldmere, arrived in Branston a full day before he was expected. I want to be clear about why, because his reasons matter considerably more than they might at first appear. He was not by nature a man who enjoyed uncertainty. He was precise and reserved, and had a methodical mind that his Yorkshire neighbours had spent 30 years describing as cold, because precision is frequently mistaken for coldness by people who prefer to feel their way through difficulties rather than think through them. He had agreed to this marriage arrangement out of the same pragmatic necessities that had driven Sir Douglas to propose it. He had reviewed the settlement figures, confirmed the legal particulars, accepted the terms in principle. And then he had sat with the whole arrangement for a fortnight and found, to his own discomfort, that he could not quite make himself stop thinking about what sort of woman he was agreeing to spend the rest of his life with. Not the financial mechanics, the woman. He had never met her. He had no means of knowing her except through a solicitor's dry summary. Elder daughter, 28 years, manages the household accounts, unmarried, which told him nothing of any consequence, and so he had done the only thing a methodical man could think to do under the circumstances. He had come to Branston a day early, in a plain travelling coat, with his luggage properly arranged on a hired cart, and taken a room at the village inn under the name Mr. Fenwick, without his title, which in a village that had never had cause to follow the movements of the Yorkshire peerage meant precisely nothing to anyone. He did not intend to deceive, he intended to see. The village of Branston provided him with his first opportunity the following morning. There had been a storm in the night, a proper October storm, the kind that takes slates off roofs and brings old trees down across the lanes. And when he came down to breakfast at the inn, the public room was buzzing with the particular civic energy that a small community generates after a bad night. He did not have to wait long. A woman arrived at the inn around mid-morning on foot, in a heavy wool coat that had seen better years, carrying a small notebook. She had a face of strong, clean lines, the kind of face that is simply overlooked in youth, because youth does not yet know what it is looking at. She moved through the room with the purposeful, unhurried directness of someone who has a specific task and intends to complete it without unnecessary conversation, which is to say she moved quite differently from the way most people move through rooms when they suspect they might be observed. He watched her speak to the innkeeper. He was too far away to hear the words clearly, but he could read the exchange well enough. She was gathering storm damage reports, making a list, asking systematic questions. The innkeeper, a stout man with a grey moustache who seemed to Lord Fenwick's eye to be not easily impressed, answered her with an ease and a respect that was not deferential so much as earned, the kind of respect a man gives to someone who has proved, over time and in small concrete ways, that they are worth listening to. There is a difference, my dear friends, between being deferred to and being respected. Deference is a performance. Respect is an opinion, formed quietly across years, and it cannot be manufactured in an afternoon. I have lived long enough to know that the people who command genuine respect in a small community, not because of their title or their face, but because of the consistent quality of what they actually do, are almost never the people who end up remarked upon. They are the people who kept things from being worse than they might have been. Lord Fenwick watched Miss Aldgate complete her list. He watched her thank the innkeeper by name and mean it. He watched her pause at the door to give what appeared to be clear, specific instructions to a young man waiting outside. Instructions received with the visible relief of someone who had not known what to do and now did, and then she was gone, back out into the October morning with her notebook and her purpose. And Lord Fenwick sat for a moment with his tea gone cold, and felt, for the first time since his solicitor had put this proposal in front of him, something that was not merely pragmatic calculation. The second encounter came that same afternoon. He had gone walking along the lane behind Aldgate Hall, not intending to eavesdrop, I would emphasize, only to have a proper look at the property he was likely to be connected with for some considerable time, and he had come around a bend in the lane to find, quite unexpectedly, two women seated on a low stone wall at the edge of the grounds, deep in what appeared to be a disagreement. He stopped. The lane curved, the hedge was thick, the afternoon air was still. They had not seen him. He stood and, "I will be honest with you, because I am always honest with you," he listened. "You are making this far more complicated than it needs to be," the younger one was saying. Arabella's voice was bright and clear, the voice of a young woman who has never had occasion to lower it. "He is coming to see me. Papa has made that entirely clear. All I need to do is be agreeable and look well, and the thing is as good as settled. The only way it goes wrong is if you say something terribly sensible at dinner and remind him there is a practical woman in the house." "There is a practical woman in the house," said Frances, and her voice was quieter than her sister's, but carried with a clarity that still air will give to quiet voices if the words are meant. "That is rather the point, Arabella. He is coming because of me, whether Papa has understood that or not. The settlement is mine. My signature is what this arrangement requires. I think we ought to be honest about that, at least between ourselves." "Oh, Frances." Arabella's tone was fond and slightly pitying at once, the tone of a person who considers frankness a charming eccentricity. In someone it will never hurt. Nobody worries about the legal particulars. What matters is the impression one makes, and I make a very good impression. You are far better at figures than I am, and I am far better at first impressions than you are. And between us we shall manage this perfectly well." A silence, then Frances spoke again. "And if he is not kind," not loudly, not accusingly, simply with the quietness of someone asking a question they already know will be dismissed. "Kind," Arabella laughed, not unkindly, but with the genuine bafflement of a young woman to whom the questions seemed beside the point. "He is a Viscount, Frances. He is rich, and he is titled, and he will clear Papa's obligations, and I shall have a proper house in London, and I rather think that is quite enough to be getting on with. Kindness is a luxury." The silence that followed was brief. When Frances spoke, her voice still held its evenness, but underneath it was something that Lord Fenwick would later describe as the sound of someone saying a true thing for the 100th time to people who have never yet listened. "A home without kindness is not a home," she said. "It is simply an address. I have spent 7 years keeping this house running, and I can tell you with some authority that what makes a house livable is not the income and not the roof and not the social engagements. It is whether the people in it are, on the whole, decent to one another. Everything else is arrangement. Only kindness makes it a place worth coming home to." Arabella made a small, affectionate sound that suggested she found this both touching and impractical. "Come along. I need your help with my hair before dinner." They moved away through the October afternoon, their voices fading among the bare trees, and Lord Jasper Fenwick, Viscount of Coldmere, stood alone in the muddy lane, and felt a decision settle into him with the quiet, irrevocable weight of a key turning in a lock. He presented himself at Aldgate Hall the following morning, at the appointed hour, in his own carriage, under his full name and title, exactly as the formal arrangements required. He had his luggage with him. I mention this only because a man who intends to conduct himself properly arrives with his affairs in order. Sir Douglas came out to meet him on the steps, with the effusive relief of a man watching the answer to his most pressing problem drive up the gravel. Lady Aldgate was all flutter and graciousness. Arabella stood in the centre of the entrance hall in a gown of pale yellow that suited her colouring admirably, with a smile so perfectly composed it might have been prepared in advance, which of course it had been, and Francis stood a step behind and to one side, in a gown of dark green wool, carrying nothing, expecting nothing, with the expression of a woman who has arranged a room for an occasion. She does not quite believe she will be invited to attend. Lord Fenwick stepped inside. He received Sir Douglas's greeting with courteous brevity. He acknowledged Lady Aldgate. He met Arabella's curtsy with a polite and entirely neutral inclination of his head, and she felt, behind the perfect smile, a small flicker of something she could not immediately identify. A slight miscalculation in his manner that her preparations had not quite accounted for. And then he turned, quite deliberately, from Arabella and addressed the woman in the dark green wool standing behind her. "Miss Aldgate," he said, "Miss Frances Aldgate." It was not a question. Frances, who had not expected to be addressed first, or possibly at all, looked at him with a composure that cost her considerably more than it showed. "My lord." "I have reviewed the settlement agreement with my solicitor," Lord Fenwick said, and his voice was measured and unhurried and carried to every corner of the suddenly very quiet hall. "The arrangement, as I understand you are aware, is tied entirely to the marriage settlement held in your name from your maternal grandmother's estate. It is your signature the agreement requires, and your consent that the arrangement depends upon entirely. I thought it best that we be clear about that from the outset, rather than allow any misunderstanding to take root and cause difficulty later." The silence in that hall had a very particular quality, the quality of a room full of people whose entire understanding of a situation has just been revised, all at once without warning. Sir Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. The colour had left his face with the speed of a man who has just understood, from someone else's very clear statement, that a document he had read twice had never truly been read at all. Arabella stood very still. The yellow gown was as lovely as it had been 60 seconds ago. The smile had not fallen so much as lost all of its meaning. And Frances Aldgate stood in the entrance hall of the house she had managed for 7 years, and looked at the man who had just said, in front of her entire family, the thing that no one in that family had yet managed to say. That she was the one whose name was on the document, that her consent was the thing that made the whole arrangement possible, and felt something shiftable weight of a tide, with the slow, unmistakable weight of a tide changing. "You knew," she said very quietly, so that only he could hear it, "before you arrived. You already knew." "I knew what the document said," Lord Fenwick replied, just as quietly. "I did not know, until yesterday, what manner of woman was behind it. Those two things turned out to be considerably more connected than I had anticipated." He requested a private meeting that same afternoon. She granted it, in the small estate office where she had spent the better part of 7 years, doing the work that kept Aldgate Hall from quietly coming apart at the seams. He told her everything, and he did not soften any of it. He told her about his father's failed speculations and the encumbered northern properties, and the precise figure of his outstanding obligations, and the specific mechanism by which her grandmother's settlement would resolve them. He explained the legal particulars clearly, both what the settlement would do for him and what the marriage portion arrangement would do for her father, so that she understood exactly whose interests were being served by whose cooperation and in what proportion. He told her he had arrived a day early, and why, and then he told her, with a directness that she would later describe as the strangest form of courtesy she had ever encountered, exactly what he had observed. "I watched you come into the inn yesterday morning," he said, with a notebook and a list, "the morning after a bad storm, before most of the village had finished breakfast. And I watched the innkeeper speak to you the way men speak to people they have found, over years, to be genuinely worth consulting." He paused. "And I stood in the lane behind the hall yesterday afternoon and heard you tell your sister that a home without kindness is not a home, it is simply an address." He let that sit. "I am offering you an address, Miss Aldgate. A considerable one, a house in the North Riding, a title and a set of obligations I cannot pretend will be light. But I find myself, somewhat unexpectedly, wanting to offer all of it to a woman who appears to understand the difference between an address and a home. I find those two things are not, in fact, as separable as I had previously assumed." Frances was quiet for some time. She was a woman who thought before she spoke, which had often been taken for slowness, and was in fact the exact opposite. "You stood in a lane," she said at last, "and listened to a private conversation without announcing yourself." "Yes. I find that uncomfortable, my lord. However fortunate the outcome might appear from where I am presently sitting." "As do I," he said, without flinching. "I am not here to defend the method as admirable. I am here to tell you it was the most honest one available to me, a man proposing to marry a woman he has never met, in circumstances that give every person around her excellent reason to present her as favorably as possible, has very limited means of seeing past the presentation to the person. I chose to see the person. I am not proud of how I managed it. I am entirely certain of what it showed me." She studied him with the clear, unhurried intentions she brought to everything that mattered. "And if what it had shown you," she said, "had been someone you did not wish to choose, then I would have married you regardless," he said. "The document requires your signature, and the financial reality has not changed, and I am not in any position to let sentiment override necessity. But I would have come to this meeting expecting very little, and braced for a long, politely managed arrangement with no warmth in it." He paused. "Instead, I find myself in the rather unfamiliar position of hoping for considerably more than I had any right to expect when I left Yorkshire." She asked him for 2 days to consider her answer. He agreed without the smallest hesitation. And then he went back to the inn, and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was more unsettled about her answer than he had been about anything in the preceding 3 years of financial difficulty. Frances spent those 2 days walking the grounds of Aldgate Hall. It was October, the leaves were down, the air was sharp, and the grounds had the stripped, honest look that autumn gives to everything it touches. She walked and she thought, which was always her method, when she had something important to decide, because she had learned very early that the difference between a wise decision and a poor one was almost always how long you were willing to sit with the discomfort before you committed to anything. She thought about the document with her name in it that her father had never quite read. She thought about a man who had come into a village inn with mud on his boots and noticed a woman making a list. She thought about what it meant that he had told her the truth about his finances, plainly and without softening when he had no practical reason to do so. A man who intends simply to acquire a wife does not, generally, explain the cost. She came to him on the morning of the 3rd day, alone, in her usual wool coat, and sat down across from him in the inn's small private parlour, and said, without any preamble, the thing she had decided she needed to say before she could honestly say anything else. "I have one condition before I give you my answer, my lord, and it is not about the settlement, or the properties, or any of the practical arrangements." She met his eyes with the steadiness that he was coming to understand, simply how she was. "You said you came here to find a wife worth choosing. I need you to understand what you would actually be choosing, rather than what you may have constructed from 2 observations, and 1 overheard sentence on an October afternoon. I am 28 years old. I have managed this household since I was 21. I am tired in a way that does not resolve after a good night's sleep, the kind of tiredness that comes from being relied upon completely by people who have never once asked how you are managing." She paused, and for just a moment, the evenness in her voice had something underneath it. Not anger, and not grief, but something harder and more honest than either. "I am not serene, my lord. I am not a saint. I said what I said to my sister about kindness and addresses because I believe it, but I also said it because I have been saying the same true thing in one form or another to the same people who never acted on it, for a very long time. I am rather worn by being the person in the room who says the true thing that no one heeds." She looked at him steadily. "I would like very much to be chosen, but I would rather not be chosen for a version of myself that does not exist. I am not the quiet wisdom you may have imagined you overheard behind that wall. I am a tired woman of 28 who has been useful to people who did not see her, and who would like, very much, more than she generally permits herself to admit, to be seen." Lord Fenwick looked at her for a long moment, and something in his own careful, reserved expression gave way entirely. "I did not fall in love with a saint," he said. "I fell in love with a woman who came into a public room the morning after a storm with a notebook and a purpose when she had every reason to leave it for someone else to manage. I fell in love with a woman who told her sister that a home is made of kindness in a voice that sounded, if I am being entirely honest with you, considerably less like wisdom and rather more like someone who has been saying the right thing for so long to people who never listened, that she has begun to wonder if the saying of it was ever worth anything at all." He paused. "I'm not offering you serenity, Miss Aldgate. I have very little of it myself, and I have spent 3 years performing a version of composure I do not actually possess, which is exhausting in a way I believe you would recognize immediately. I am offering you honesty, and my genuine intention to be the kind of man who turns an address into a home, and I find I would rather make that attempt with a woman who is tired and direct, and occasionally cross, than with a woman who has not yet had sufficient cause to be any of those things." And Frances Aldgate, who had spent 7 years being the person who held Aldgate Hall together while the people she held it together for, looked directly through her, looked at the first man who had ever looked at the scaffolding, and troubled himself to wonder about the person inside it, and said yes. Not because she had been waiting to be chosen, though she had been far longer than she had ever allowed herself to think about in the daylight hours. She said yes because he had told her the truth about his debts and his failures and his imperfect method of finding her, and had then sat across from her and asked her plainly to be imperfect back. She was practical enough to recognize how rare that was. She was honest enough not to pretend she did not want it. Arabella took the news rather better than anyone might have expected once the first day had passed. I want to say this clearly, because I have not made her a villain in this story, and I do not intend for the ending to treat her as one. She was hurt, genuinely and deeply. A young woman who has been taught since childhood that her beauty is her primary asset does not easily absorb the discovery that the wealthiest man in the room looked straight past it. She was hurt for a day, and then she was angry for half a day, which seems to me entirely reasonable, and Frances sat with her through portions of it, which tells you rather more about Frances than any other detail in this story. But Arabella was not at her heart a shallow or a cruel young woman. She was simply a young woman who had been given a very narrow education in her own worth, and who was now being offered, by circumstances, a somewhat broader one. Within the month she had been introduced to a warm and considerably smitten gentleman from the neighbouring county, a man of no grand title but considerable genuine affection, who admired her in a way that made no conditions. She was, by all later accounts I could gather, rather happier in that marriage than she would have been in any arrangement with a precise and methodical Viscount. There are temperaments that suit different kinds of partnership, and there is no shame in that. There is only the relief of finding the right one. And that, my dear friends, is where I leave them. a viscount who arrived in Branston with a contract and found something he had not thought to look for, and the woman who had spent 7 years being the spine of a household that never troubled to read what was written there, until a stranger came with mud on his boots and a methodical mind and sat down in the corner of a village inn with a cup of tea he forgot to drink, and saw, in the space of one October morning, what the people who had known her for 28 years had somehow managed to miss entirely. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the way we sought the people closest to us. Sir Douglas Aldgate had 2 daughters, and he had decided, without ever quite making the decision, which is the most dangerous kind of deciding, which one was worth choosing and which one was worth relying upon. He had built his entire plan for salvation around that assumption, never once pausing to look at the document on his own desk that told him precisely which daughter had been quietly holding the whole structure up. It took a stranger, standing in a muddy lane in October, to read in 2 overheard sentences what a father had failed to read in 28 years. Be careful, my dear friends, how you sort the people who are nearest to you. The one you have filed away as steady and capable and simply fine, the one you count on so completely that you have stopped counting them as a person, may be remarkable in ways that your own long familiarity has made entirely invisible to you. And the remarkable thing about invisible people is not that they are absent. It is that they have been there the whole time, holding the roof up, keeping the accounts, saying the true thing quietly in rooms full of people who never quite listened, until someone finally did. If you have been sitting with me here tonight for a good while now and find you would like a proper seat by the fire, the membership button is just below this video, and it costs very little, and it would mean a great deal to me to know exactly who is in the room. There are a great many more of these stories, and every one of them has a heart in it somewhere, and I should hate for you to miss a single one. If you will not join tonight, then you know very well what I am going to say. You owe me one, you have owed me, since a viscount stood alone in an October lane and heard a tired woman say that a home without kindness is only an address, and understood, quite suddenly, that he had been living in an address for rather too long. Come back to me here at Moonlight at Bellwood, where the fire is always lit and the stories are always true in the ways that matters most. Subscribe. And do look, won't you, at the person nearest to you who has been holding things together quietly and asking for nothing in return. Just look at them. Honestly, the way a stranger might if a stranger were paying the kind of attention that familiarity has long since made difficult. It is, I promise you, not too late to see what has been standing there all along.